In the far western corner of Europe, where the land meets the restless Atlantic, Portugal emerged as a small but determined kingdom with outsized ambition. Sandwiched between Spain and the vast sea, its geography was both constraint and opportunity, shaping a people who looked outward toward horizons yet unseen. In the centuries following the Reconquista, when Christian kingdoms reclaimed territory from Muslim rule, Portugal's hard-won stability and natural boundaries laid the foundation for something new. A kingdom not just tied to land, but defined by the sea. Along its long, jagged coast, fishing communities and shipyards flourished. Generations of Portuguese mariners honed their skills on turbulent Atlantic waters, learning to read wind and wave, to patch sails and repair hulls, to find their way home guided only by stars and shifting tides. It was this intimate relationship with the ocean that seeded an early maritime tradition, one that would soon grow into the driving force behind Portugal's astonishing expansion across the globe. But geography alone did not set the Portuguese on their path of discovery. They were driven also by trade, faith, and the restless spirit of technological innovation. In the early 15th century, Europe hungered for the spices, silks, and precious stones of the East, goods that passed through labyrinthine overland routes controlled by Arab and Venetian middlemen. Cut off from these lucrative markets, Portugal sought a new path to the riches of Asia, one that bypassed traditional gatekeepers and would fill its coffers directly. Religious zeal also played a role. The age was marked by crusading fervor, the desire to spread Christianity, and the deeply held belief that non-Christian peoples were ripe for conversion. For Portuguese kings and nobles, the promise of both profit and piety lay beyond the horizon, in lands rumored to be populated by strange creatures and mythical Christian allies like the fabled Prester John. Meanwhile, advances in shipbuilding and navigation provided the tools to make dreams reality. The caravel, a nimble and sturdy vessel with lateen sails, allowed sailors to tack against contrary winds and explore dangerous coasts. Innovations in cartography, spurred by scholars and pilots at places like Prince Henry the Navigator's court, transformed old medieval maps into charts of growing accuracy. Mariners learned to use the astrolabe and compass, reading celestial bodies and finding their position with increasing confidence. Navigators of the edge. As these threads, ambition, geography, trade, faith, and technology wove together, Portugal turned toward the ocean with newfound purpose. What was once an unpredictable expanse filled with monsters and mystery became, in Portuguese minds, a bridge to power and glory. In the coming centuries, their ships would round Africa's capes, chart Indian Ocean trade routes, seize footholds from Brazil to China, and ferry gold, spices, slaves, and faith across continents. This is the story of the Portuguese Empire, a tale of daring and destruction, of explorers and conquerors, of adaptation to unfamiliar worlds, and the creation of new global connections. It is also a story of exploitation, of indigenous peoples, of enslaved Africans, of entire cultures reshaped under the weight of Portuguese ambition. Yet within this vast, conflicted legacy lies a crucial chapter in human history, the beginning of modern globalization, the forging of ties that would bind continents in trade, language, culture, and conflict. Here, at the edge of Europe, a small kingdom set in motion forces that would ripple across oceans and centuries. The Portuguese, once confined to narrow borders and threatened by powerful neighbours, would transform themselves into navigators of the edge, a people who embraced the sea as both frontier and bridge, whose voyages of discovery would leave a complicated, enduring imprint on the world. This is their story. Beginnings, Reconquista and the Spirit of the Sea. The completion of the Portuguese Reconquista in 1249 marked a defining moment in the history of Portugal. For centuries, Christian kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula had fought to push back Muslim rule, gradually reclaiming territory from the Moors, who had held much of the region since the early 8th century. The final conquest of the Algarve region in the south brought the borders of Portugal to their modern configuration, giving the young kingdom a secure foundation from which to look outward rather than inward. This newfound stability at home created the conditions necessary for the Portuguese to shift their ambitions beyond their shores, seeking opportunity across the seas. Portugal, a narrow strip of land pressed against the Atlantic, had always possessed a close relationship with the sea. Its people were fishermen, traders and shipbuilders, their livelihoods tied to the rhythms of tides and winds. In the fishing villages that dotted the coast, generations had ventured into the Atlantic's cold, rough waters, hauling in cod, sardines and mackerel, learning the habits of the ocean and the craft of seamanship. Along the Tagus and Douro, rivers, shipyards bustled with activity, building sturdy vessels capable of surviving unpredictable Atlantic storms. This long maritime tradition was not born of sudden inspiration, but of necessity, woven into the fabric of daily life by geography and survival. Trade with North Africa had also been a constant feature of Portuguese coastal life. Even during the Reconquista, Portuguese merchants and sailors ventured southward, exchanging iron, wool and wine for gold, salt and other goods from Morocco and beyond. These early exchanges exposed Portuguese sailors to Muslim navigational techniques, maps and instruments, precious knowledge that would later underpin their push into the unknown Atlantic. Through these interactions, Portuguese craftsmen learned of new sail designs, improved rudders, and methods of reading the stars to guide voyages when the coastline faded from view. But it was in the early 15th century that Portugal's maritime ambitions began to take on a new and organized form, guided by the figure of Prince Henry the Navigator. Born in 1394, Henry was the third son of King John I, and thus unlikely to inherit the throne. Yet his ambitions would shape the course of Portugal's future more profoundly than any king of his age. Henry was driven by a mixture of motives: religious zeal to spread Christianity, curiosity about lands beyond the known world, and the practical desire to secure Portugal's place in the lucrative trade of gold and spices that flowed from Africa and Asia. Henry established himself at Sagres, a small promontory on the southwestern tip of Portugal, where the land meets the restless Atlantic in sheer cliffs and crashing waves. Here, according to tradition, he gathered cartographers, astronomers, shipbuilders, and seasoned sailors, fostering an informal school of navigation that advanced Europe's understanding of the seas. While modern historians debate the existence of a formal school, there is little doubt that Sagres became a nexus of learning and experimentation under Henry's patronage. Under Henry's watch, Portuguese sailors began to push farther south along Africa's western coast than any European had dared before. They charted currents and winds, mapped dangerous shoals, and learned to work with the seasonal rhythms of the Atlantic. Each voyage brought back new information: corrections to maps, improved charts of winds and tides, and reports of African kingdoms and coastal peoples previously unknown in Europe. At Sagres, these bits of knowledge were compiled, compared, and refined, creating a body of practical science that fueled further voyages. Henry also championed innovations in ship design. The caravel, a nimble, light vessel with lateen sails that allowed it to tack into the wind, emerged in this period. It was not a massive warship, but rather a vessel designed for exploration and trade, capable of hugging coastlines yet sturdy enough for open sea travel. This technological edge would prove crucial as Portuguese sailors ventured beyond the familiar waters of Iberia. Beyond the science and technology, there was also a sense of mission. Henry and his contemporaries believed they were continuing the Reconquista by other means, carrying Christianity southward into Africa, striking at Muslim power in new theatres, and spreading the faith as they expanded their knowledge of the world. Chronicles of the time echo this conviction, weaving tales of conquest and conversion with reports of gold, ivory, and spices waiting on distant shores. Religious fervour and economic ambition fused into a single national purpose, driving Portugal's gaze ever outward. By the time of Henry's death in 1460, Portuguese explorers had ventured past Cape Bojador, once considered the edge of the known world by Europeans, and reached as far as modern-day Sierra Leone. Though the riches and routes Henry dreamed of had not yet fully materialized, he laid the groundwork for the great wave of exploration that would follow. Portugal had become a kingdom not merely content with defending its borders, but one that saw the ocean as its frontier and the horizon as its destiny. The establishment of the so-called Sagres School during the early 15th century was a milestone in Portugal's transformation from a small coastal kingdom into a leader of European exploration. Though historians debate whether a formal institution existed in Sagres, there is little doubt that Prince Henry the Navigator gathered together a community of scholars, shipbuilders, cartographers, and pilots near this wind-swept cape on Portugal's southern tip. Sagres became a magnet for the curious and the ambitious, men drawn by the lure of the unknown sea and the promise of wealth, knowledge, and Christian expansion. Under Henry's patronage, the community at Sagres compiled and refined maps, studied currents and winds, and adapted navigational tools from other cultures, especially from the Muslim world. They examined the astrolabe, improved upon the quadrant, and carefully recorded the position of stars to guide ships beyond sight of land. Charts were revised continually, incorporating observations from each new expedition. Coastal profiles, dangerous reefs, prevailing winds, all were painstakingly added to new portolan maps that guided mariners farther south along Africa's Atlantic rim. Sagres also became the birthplace of the caravel, a small light vessel with triangular lateen sails that allowed it to tack against the wind. Unlike the bulkier square-rigged ships used in northern waters, the caravel could maneuver along Africa's unpredictable coasts and push steadily into the stiff northeasterly trade winds. It was an instrument of discovery, perfectly suited to the challenges of the open Atlantic and narrow coastal passages. This marriage of new technology and precise navigation would prove decisive in the decades to come. With improved ships and growing confidence, the Portuguese began to send out their first tentative expeditions past the forbidding headlands of West Africa. For centuries, Europeans had feared the sea beyond Cape Bojador, a wind-swept promontory on the Sahara's edge that mariners believed marked the edge of the known world. Myths swirled of boiling waters, sea monsters, and a sun so intense that it would scorch any ship that dared to pass. But in 1434, Portuguese captain Gil Eanes, sailing under Henry's command, rounded Cape Bojador safely, proving the old legends wrong and opening the way south. This breakthrough was both symbolic and practical. It shattered psychological barriers and encouraged further voyages along Africa's coastline. Portuguese captains pushed south along the coasts of present-day Western Sahara, Mauritania, and Senegal. They established small outposts and fortified trading posts to protect the flow of goods and information back to Portugal. In these early ventures, Portuguese sailors traded European goods, textiles, metal tools, weapons, for gold, ivory, and pepper. But it was the promise of another commodity that began to reshape both Portuguese ambitions and African societies: slaves. While small-scale slave trading existed in North Africa and Europe for centuries, the Portuguese now began to participate directly in the growing commerce of enslaved Africans. Expeditions brought captives back to Portugal, where they were sold in markets or kept by the nobility as household servants and field labourers. This traffic was still small in scale compared to what would come later, but it laid the foundations of a brutal system that would transform both continents in centuries to come. Meanwhile, Portuguese navigators continued to push farther south in search of a direct route to the gold-rich kingdoms of West Africa, and beyond that, to the fabled lands of spice and wealth in India. They collected reports of mighty rivers, the Senegal, the Gambia, and glimpsed powerful African states whose rulers controlled trade routes far into the interior. They learned of caravans bearing salt and gold across the Sahara and of vast cities beyond their reach. Every voyage brought home new fragments of knowledge, fueling both maps and ambition. Though the profits were still modest and the risks high, the Portuguese crown and Henry himself saw these voyages as a vital long-term investment. Each new stretch of charted coastline, each encounter with African traders, each small cargo of gold or pepper strengthened Portugal's grip on the Atlantic's southern rim. Bit by bit, the mysterious coast of Africa began to take shape on European maps, no longer a blank or a realm of monsters, but a place of opportunity and danger, rich with human cultures and natural resources. By the time of Henry's death in 1460, Portuguese mariners had reached as far south as modern-day Sierra Leone. Their small trading forts dotted the coast, and the outlines of a new world were beginning to emerge from the once feared waters. The Sagres community had provided the tools, the knowledge, and the ships. The spirit of curiosity and ambition, ignited in the windswept halls of that coastal promontory, would carry Portugal farther still in the decades to come. Chapter 2. Africa's Atlantic Shores, Gold and Slaves. By the middle of the 15th century, Portuguese expeditions had pushed steadily southward along Africa's Atlantic coast, driven by a mix of curiosity, religious zeal, and hunger for profit. The once feared seas beyond Cape Bojador were now regularly traversed, and each new voyage brought Portuguese sailors into contact with new stretches of coastline and new African societies. By the 1440s, Portuguese captains had reached the broad mouths of the Senegal and Gambia rivers, vital waterways that flowed deep into the continent's interior and connected to rich trade networks long dominated by North African and local African merchants. These rivers were lifelines of commerce, carrying gold dust, ivory, hides, and enslaved people from inland regions to coastal markets. To the Portuguese, they seemed like gateways to the legendary goldfields of West Africa, lands described in Arab chronicles and whispered of in European courts as places of unimaginable wealth. The Senegal and Gambia basins were home to powerful kingdoms, including Tekrur and Jolof, whose rulers commanded caravans that moved salt, gold, and other goods across the Sahara to the Mediterranean world. Recognizing the strategic and economic importance of these rivers, Portuguese captains began to establish footholds along the coast. They built small wooden forts known as feitorias, where they could defend their merchants, store goods, and negotiate with local rulers. These early trading posts served not as centers of conquest, but as outposts of diplomacy and commerce. In exchange for European goods such as iron bars, cloth, beads, and firearms, African traders brought gold dust, ivory, and captives for the growing slave markets in Portugal and elsewhere. At first, Portuguese traders relied heavily on local middlemen and interpreters to manage transactions and build trust with African leaders. They quickly learned the complex web of alliances and rivalries among coastal communities and inland powers. Some African rulers welcomed the Portuguese as new trading partners who brought valuable goods and a fresh source of military support against regional rivals. Others remained wary or hostile, attacking Portuguese ships or forts when negotiations soured or suspicions arose. The Portuguese crown and noble investors saw these forts and trading posts as critical assets. They granted charters and licenses to private merchants, encouraging them to explore further and secure profitable contracts with African rulers. In return, the crown demanded a share of the profits, especially in gold, which became a vital component of Portugal's growing wealth. Gold from the rivers of Senegal and Gambia began flowing northward to Lisbon, where it was minted into coins that funded further exploration and strengthened the monarchy's hand in European politics. These early outposts along the West African coast also served as staging points for longer expeditions down the Atlantic Rim. Portuguese captains launched reconnaissance voyages southward, mapping coastlines and testing winds and currents that would later guide ships toward the equator and beyond. The forts provided safe harbors for resupply and repair, allowing the Portuguese to extend their reach steadily farther along Africa's shores. Meanwhile, the trade in enslaved Africans began to grow alongside commerce in gold and ivory. Though slavery was already practiced within African societies and across the Islamic world, Portuguese demand began to reshape regional patterns of warfare, raiding, and tribute. Captives taken in conflicts between African states were sold to Portuguese traders, who transported them to markets in Lisbon, Seville, and other Iberian cities. Enslaved Africans were put to work as domestic servants, field labourers, and artisans, with some sent onward to Mediterranean plantations and mining operations. By the 1450s, ship manifests reveal regular shipments of enslaved men, women, and children from the Senegambian coast to Portugal. The Portuguese crown regulated this trade, granting monopolies to favoured merchants and imposing taxes on each captive sold. Although still limited in scale compared to what would come later, this trade established patterns that would expand dramatically in the following centuries, eventually underpinning the vast transatlantic slave trade. In the meantime, the Portuguese presence along the West African coast was far from secure. Forts required constant maintenance and defence, and local alliances were fragile. Disease, unfamiliar climates, and occasional attacks by African forces took a steady toll on Portuguese personnel. Yet the lure of gold and the early profits from trade kept the momentum going. Each new expedition brought back not only riches, but also precious knowledge, better maps, new navigational routes, and reports of still more prosperous kingdoms to the south. Thus, by the middle of the 15th century, the Portuguese had laid the foundation for a vast trading empire stretching from their home shores to the river basins of West Africa. They had proven that the Atlantic was not a barrier, but a highway, a bridge connecting European ambition with African wealth and human lives. This fragile network of forts and alliances would serve as the backbone for the expansion that lay ahead, an expansion driven by gold, spices, slaves, and a restless spirit that refused to be bound by the horizon. As Portuguese exploration pushed deeper into the coasts of West Africa, the trade in gold, ivory, and pepper flourished, creating a steady flow of wealth into Lisbon and fueling the kingdom's growing ambitions. From the banks of the Senegal and Gambia rivers to the shores of modern-day Guinea, Portuguese ships anchored off coastal settlements and estuaries, exchanging textiles, metal goods, and simple manufactured wares for prized African commodities. Gold, mined inland and carried along caravan routes to the rivers, was especially coveted. It arrived in small nuggets and dust, often wrapped in leather pouches, and was weighed carefully against standard measures brought by Portuguese merchants. The influx of gold from West Africa helped to stabilize Portugal's currency and enriched its nobility, bolstering the power of the crown at home and strengthening its hand in European diplomacy. Ivory was another highly prized commodity. Portuguese traders collected tusks of elephants hunted by African communities, which were then transported north to Portugal. There, ivory was carved into religious icons, decorative objects, and luxury goods for European markets. Demand was high, and the trade thrived alongside gold, helping Portuguese traders establish deeper relationships with coastal rulers and middlemen who controlled the flow of goods from the interior. Pepper, too, became an increasingly valuable cargo. Though not as lucrative as gold, pepper was highly sought after in Europe as both a spice and a preservative, and its steady supply from West Africa added another layer to the Portuguese mercantile network. But it was the trade in human beings that would have the most far-reaching and tragic impact. As Portuguese captains established permanent trading posts and forts along the coast, they began to buy and transport enslaved Africans in growing numbers. While slavery had existed for centuries across Africa and the Mediterranean, the Portuguese became the first European nation to systematically organize, scale, and institutionalize the practice of shipping enslaved Africans to Europe. This was not merely opportunistic commerce. It became an integral part of Portugal's expanding imperial enterprise, tied to the demand for labor in Iberia and later across its Atlantic colonies. Records from the mid to late 15th century show Portuguese ships carrying thousands of enslaved Africans to Lisbon and other Iberian ports. These men, women and children were sold in bustling markets or taken into households and estates as servants, agricultural workers, or skilled laborers. Some were absorbed into urban life, working as porters, dockhands, and artisans in Portuguese cities. Others labored in rural areas, where they contributed to the expansion of agriculture and the development of new commercial ventures, including sugar cultivation in Atlantic island colonies like Madeira and São Tomé. This burgeoning trade was not random or informal. The Portuguese crown quickly moved to regulate and tax it, granting charters to favored merchants and collecting a share of the profits. Slaving expeditions became tightly organized ventures, often involving powerful Lisbon families and well-connected financiers who pooled resources, outfitted ships, and negotiated prices with African intermediaries. In coastal forts like Elmina, built later in the 15th century in modern-day Ghana, the Portuguese established permanent bases to coordinate the trade, store captives, and protect their interests against both rival Europeans and potential African resistance. The slave trade's entrenchment in Portuguese commerce laid the foundation for what would later become the massive transatlantic slave networks that defined the early modern Atlantic world. By perfecting the logistics of capture, transport, and sale, while establishing patterns of tribute, warfare, and raiding in partnership with local African rulers, the Portuguese created the framework that other European powers would follow and expand upon in the centuries to come. Though initially limited to routes connecting Africa to Iberia, this system of trade in human lives would eventually extend across the Atlantic, feeding labor demands in the sugar plantations of Brazil and the Caribbean, and leaving a legacy of suffering and displacement that would scar the world for generations. Yet in these early decades, Portuguese merchants and crown officials viewed the trade in enslaved Africans as simply another commodity in the vast exchange of goods. Like gold, ivory, or pepper, human beings became cargo, valued, quantified, and recorded in ship manifests and royal ledgers. For the Portuguese, the profits seemed to justify the brutal cost, and the emerging maritime empire grew stronger on the backs of the captives it carried northward. As the 15th century neared its close, Portugal stood on the brink of an even wider expansion, poised to turn its newfound mastery of Atlantic trade into a global enterprise that would reshape continents and centuries to come. Sounding dart. The Cape, Vasco da Gama, and the sea route to India. In the closing years of the 15th century, Portuguese exploration achieved one of its greatest triumphs, a feat that would transform global commerce, shift the balance of power in Europe, and reshape the world's understanding of the sea. This chapter of history begins with Bartolomeu Diaz, a seasoned navigator and captain who in 1488 achieved what had seemed impossible for generations. He rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa, proving once and for all that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected. Diaz's voyage was the culmination of decades of Portuguese probing along Africa's Atlantic coast. Commissioned by King John II of Portugal, Diaz set sail in 1487 with a small fleet tasked with finding a sea route around Africa to reach the markets of India. Driven south by fierce storms and guided by the Atlantic's powerful currents, Diaz's ships veered eastward into the unknown. When they finally turned north and landed along Africa's southern coast, they realized they had rounded the continent's tip. Though Diaz's crew, exhausted and mutinous, refused to push farther toward India, the voyage was a monumental success. Diaz named the windswept cape he had passed the Cape of Storms, reflecting the treacherous seas that nearly ended his journey. But King John II, recognizing its profound significance, renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, signaling the optimism and opportunity that now lay beyond Africa's edge. The passage Diaz charted provided proof that the fabled sea route to India, long imagined but never seen, was indeed possible. Almost a decade later, Portugal would follow through on this promise. In 1497, Vasco da Gama, a young nobleman and skilled sailor, was given command of a fleet to attempt the full passage to India. Under the patronage of King Manuel I, da Gama set sail with 4 ships from Lisbon, following the path laid down by Diaz and pushing beyond it into uncharted waters. Relying on new maps, seasoned pilots, and a combination of luck and skill, da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope, navigated the dangerous currents of the southern African coast, and turned north along Africa's eastern shoreline. In Mozambique and Mombasa, da Gama encountered thriving Swahili port cities linked into the vast Indian Ocean trade networks dominated by Muslim merchants. Relations were tense and sometimes hostile. Portuguese intentions were clearly commercial and imperial, and local rulers viewed them with suspicion. Da Gama moved cautiously north, securing pilots and supplies, while avoiding entanglements with established powers. At last, in May 1498, da Gama reached the city of Calicut on India's Malabar coast, a bustling centre of the spice trade, famed for its pepper, cinnamon, and precious stones. The arrival of the Portuguese startled local traders and rulers who were accustomed to dealing with Arab, Persian, and Indian merchants, but had never seen European ships of such design. Da Gama presented himself as an envoy of the Portuguese king, seeking trade relations and access to the lucrative spice markets that had for centuries been controlled by Muslim merchants and channeled to Europe via Venetian middlemen. Though da Gama's initial reception was mixed, local Muslim merchants viewed the Portuguese as unwelcome rivals. He managed to secure enough goods to justify the long journey home. After several months negotiating and gathering cargo, da Gama began the return voyage in 1499, battling fierce storms and disease. Fewer than half his men survived, but da Gama himself made it back to Lisbon with a cargo of spices so valuable that it covered the costs of the entire expedition many times over. Da Gama's voyage was more than a commercial triumph. It was a seismic shift in world trade. For centuries, the spice trade had flowed overland from Asia to the Levant, then by ship to Venice and the rest of Europe. Arab merchants controlled much of this trade, and Venetian merchants dominated its final European leg. The Portuguese sea route to India promised to bypass these middlemen entirely, allowing direct trade with Asian markets and undercutting the prices that had enriched Venice for generations. This dismantling of Venetian and Arab trade monopolies on spices marked the beginning of Europe's maritime domination of Asian commerce. It also set the stage for fierce competition between European powers and the gradual encroachment of European fortresses and trading posts across the Indian Ocean world. For Portugal, the sea route to India was the crowning achievement of nearly a century of exploration and risk, an accomplishment that would catapult the small kingdom into the center of global trade and power. Vasco da Gama's arrival in Calicut in 1498 was only the beginning of Portugal's engagement with the rich and complex political landscape of India's Malabar coast. Here, da Gama and later Portuguese commanders quickly learned that the Indian Ocean world was no empty frontier awaiting European domination. Instead, it was a sophisticated network of powerful states, established trade guilds, and deeply rooted alliances that had flourished for centuries, connecting India, East Africa, Arabia, and Southeast Asia through commerce and culture. Calicut itself was ruled by the Zamorane, a regional Hindu monarch whose court commanded immense respect and authority. The city was a cosmopolitan hub where Arab, Persian, Indian, and even Chinese merchants had long coexisted, competing and cooperating under a system of carefully negotiated rights and privileges. Da Gama's attempts to win favor with the Zamorin were complicated by the influential Muslim merchant community, which saw the Portuguese as dangerous newcomers intent on disrupting a trade network that had enriched them for generations. Tensions flared almost immediately. Da Gama's gifts, meant as royal tribute, were considered paltry and even insulting by local standards. His blunt demands for favorable trade terms angered established Muslim traders who used their connections at court to undermine Portuguese overtures. As months passed, misunderstandings deepened into distrust. The Portuguese lacked the subtle diplomacy and understanding of local customs that generations of Muslim merchants had cultivated. They also carried an air of arrogance, armed with new cannons and confident in their maritime superiority, yet the Portuguese would not be deterred. On returning to Lisbon with his cargo of spices, da Gama was hailed as a hero. The Portuguese crown swiftly outfitted new expeditions determined to establish a lasting foothold in the Indian Ocean trade. In the early years of the 16th century, Portuguese fleets under commanders like Pedro Álvares Cabral, Francisco de Almeida, and later Afonso de Albuquerque returned to India with larger forces and more aggressive ambitions. They quickly discovered that gaining a permanent presence meant confronting not just the commercial dominance of Muslim merchants, but also the military power of regional states. In Cochin, the Portuguese found a willing ally in a rival kingdom eager to counterbalance Calicut's influence. They built a fort in Cochin, the first permanent European settlement in India, and began to shift the balance of power on the Malabar coast. Using cannons mounted on their caravels and ships, the Portuguese threatened rival ports, forcing local rulers to grant them favorable trading rights or face bombardment from the sea. Afonso de Albuquerque, who would become governor of Portuguese India, pushed this strategy further. Seeing the Indian Ocean not as an open trade network but as a sea to be dominated, he initiated a campaign of fortress building and naval control. Under Albuquerque, Portuguese forces captured the strategic city of Goa in 1510, wresting it from Muslim control and turning it into the capital of their Asian empire. Goa became both a trade hub and a military base, from which the Portuguese launched further campaigns eastward toward Malacca and the Spice Islands. Resistance from Muslim merchants and regional states was fierce and often bloody. Portuguese fleets clashed with combined forces of Egyptian Mamluks, the Ottoman Empire, and Indian allies who tried to expel them from coastal waters. In fierce naval battles, the Portuguese deployed heavily armed ships and superior artillery tactics to devastate enemy fleets, establishing themselves as a new and formidable power in the Indian Ocean. This marked the beginning of an era of European-Asian trade rivalry. For centuries, Muslim merchants from the Red Sea and Persian Gulf had dominated the spice trade routes linking Southeast Asia and India to the Middle East and Europe. Portuguese intervention fractured this system by bypassing Red Sea routes and bringing spices directly around Africa to Lisbon. The Portuguese undercut both Venetian and Arab traders, sparking new conflicts and reconfiguring global commerce. At the same time, the Portuguese approach differed sharply from existing practices. Where Indian Ocean trade had traditionally been governed by mutual agreements, tribute systems, and flexible alliances, the Portuguese imposed rigid monopolies enforced through military might. They established a system of cartesies, permits that all trading ships had to carry, bought from Portuguese authorities under threat of seizure or destruction. Through this system, Portugal claimed the right to police and tax much of the Indian Ocean trade, asserting themselves as both traders and rulers on foreign shores. Thus began a new chapter of global history, one in which Europe would increasingly shape Asian commerce and politics, sometimes through negotiation and alliance, but often through brute force and naval supremacy. The Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean would inspire both envy and resistance, setting the stage for centuries of European competition in Asia. Empire of the Indies, Goa, Malacca, and beyond. When Afonso de Albuquerque arrived in the Cross, Indian Ocean as the new Portuguese governor in the early 16th century, he brought with him a bold and uncompromising vision to transform Portugal's scattered footholds along Asia's coasts into a true empire, secured by forts and dominated by naval power. Albuquerque understood that controlling key ports and choke points was the key to dominating the lucrative spice trade and keeping rival Muslim and Asian powers at bay. Under his leadership, the Portuguese launched a series of aggressive campaigns that would redefine the European presence in Asia and lay the foundations of Portugal's Eastern Empire. In 1510, Albuquerque targeted Goa, then a thriving port on Ice, India's western coast under the rule of the Sultanate of Bijapur. Goa was strategically located and known for its shipbuilding and spice markets, making it an ideal base for further Portuguese expansion. Albuquerque, commanding a fleet of heavily armed ships and supported by alliances with local rivals of Bijapur, laid siege to Goa and captured it after fierce fighting. He immediately began fortifying the city, constructing defensive walls and establishing administrative structures that transformed Goa into the capital of Portuguese Asia. Under Portuguese rule, Goa became a center of commerce, governance, and missionary activity. Merchants brought spices, cotton, gems, and gold into its bustling markets, while Portuguese administrators imposed new systems of taxation and justice. Catholic missionaries soon followed, building churches and establishing schools that would spread European religious and cultural influence deep into the region. Over the following decades, Goa would be known as the Rome of the East, a jewel in Portugal's growing overseas empire. Albuquerque's ambition did not stop in India. In 1511, he turned his attention to Malacca, a cosmopolitan port city on the Malay Peninsula that controlled the narrow straits between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. This strait was the main artery for the spice trade between Southeast Asia and the wider world, making Malacca one of the richest and most strategically important trading hubs on Earth. Albuquerque believed that controlling Malacca would allow Portugal to dominate the flow of spices and break Muslim trade networks that had supplied Cairo, Mecca, and the Mediterranean for centuries. The conquest of Malacca was brutal and decisive. Portuguese forces stormed the city in the summer of 1511, facing fierce resistance from the local sultan and his allies. Cannon fire pounded the city's defences, while Portuguese infantry fought street by street, eventually capturing Malacca and driving out its ruler. Albuquerque established a fortress there, garrisoned it with soldiers, and quickly set about enforcing Portuguese control over trade. From Malacca, the Portuguese could monitor and tax the passage of merchant ships sailing between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. They also gained access to rich trade networks extending to the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, China, and beyond. This foothold in Southeast Asia made Portugal the first European power to establish a permanent presence in the region, a position they would hold for over a century despite rising local and European competition. Albuquerque also understood the importance of the Persian Gulf, a crucial crossroads between East and West, where powerful Muslim states controlled the trade of Persian silk, Arabian horses, and Indian goods. In 1515, Albuquerque led an expedition to the island of Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. There he negotiated with local rulers and built a formidable fortress that allowed Portugal to dominate the narrow strait through which nearly all maritime trade between Persia and India passed. By forging alliances with local rulers and using overwhelming naval force, Albuquerque laid the groundwork for a network of Portuguese strongholds stretching from the Gulf of Oman to Malacca. His strategy combined diplomacy, brute military strength, and calculated cruelty to intimidate rivals and compel cooperation. Though controversial even among his contemporaries for his harsh tactics, Albuquerque succeeded in securing for Portugal a string of fortified ports that gave it unmatched leverage over the trade routes of Asia. With these conquests, Portugal was no longer just a small European kingdom seeking fortune on the fringes of the Indian Ocean. It had become a true maritime empire, dictating the terms of trade, waging war on powerful local states, and reshaping the balance of power across Asia's seas. And as Portuguese fleets pushed further into the Spice Islands and China in the decades that followed, the foundation Albuquerque laid in Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz would remain the bedrock of Portuguese Asia for generations to come. In the decades following Afonso de Albuquerque's bold campaigns in India and Southeast Asia, the Portuguese continued to expand their maritime network eastward, searching for new markets and opportunities. One of the most remarkable episodes in this wave of expansion was the establishment of Macau in China in 1557, which would become the gateway for Portuguese trade and cultural exchange with East Asia for centuries to come. The Portuguese first reached southern China's coasts in the early 16th century, driven by reports of immense wealth and sophisticated markets in the Ming Empire. Initially, they approached Chinese ports cautiously, as foreigners were viewed with suspicion by Ming officials wary of piracy and the disruptive effects of uncontrolled trade. Early Portuguese traders often had to anchor in harbours under temporary licenses or operate through intermediaries in clandestine dealings. Encounters were sometimes tense, even violent, as the Ming Navy clashed with Portuguese ships it considered interlopers. But over time, the Portuguese adapted their strategy. They learned the intricacies of Chinese court diplomacy and the importance of offering tribute and negotiation rather than simply imposing demands by force. Portuguese envoys and merchants cultivated relationships with local officials, offering gifts and serving as intermediaries in regional disputes, often leveraging their naval power and global networks as assets to gain favor. In 1557, after years of complex negotiations and shifting political winds, the Portuguese were granted permission by Ming authorities to settle permanently on the peninsula of Macau, a small outcropping at the mouth of the Pearl River Delta. While technically under Chinese sovereignty and paying annual tribute, Macau became the first and only European settlement recognized by Imperial China, a crucial foothold in one of the world's richest trading regions. Macau blossomed into a bustling port city, where Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea were exchanged for silver brought from Japan and Spanish America, as well as European goods ranging from woolen cloth to firearms. Portuguese merchants established warehouses, docks, and houses, building a town with churches, fortresses, and winding streets that reflected both European and Asian architectural influences. Over time, Macau became a vibrant cultural crossroads, where Jesuit missionaries studied Chinese language and philosophy, hoping to convert local elites, and where merchants brokered deals that tied China to global markets. The settlement of Macau symbolized the unique blend of methods the Portuguese employed across Asia, combining commerce, missionary zeal, and the threat of military force into a flexible imperial strategy. Unlike in India or Malacca, where they often imposed control through conquest, in China, the Portuguese realized the limitations of open warfare against a powerful empire. They used diplomacy, patience, and careful negotiation to win a place within an existing political order, adapting their ambitions to Chinese realities while still securing profits and influence. This blending of trade, religion, and the sword was typical of Portuguese expansion. Across Asia, Portuguese commanders and merchants built fortified trading posts, often backed by heavily armed ships capable of bombarding rival ports or defending convoys against pirates. Alongside them came priests, especially Jesuits, who established missions, built churches, and learned local languages in the hope of spreading Catholicism and securing allies among native elites. Portuguese forts often housed both cannons and chapels, and soldiers might double as traders or guards for missionary caravans moving inland. In places where local resistance was fierce, as in Malacca and the Persian Gulf, the Portuguese relied on raw military power to establish dominance. Where this approach would have been self-defeating, as in China and Japan, they turned to negotiation, tribute, and cultural diplomacy. This pragmatism allowed them to sustain an empire despite limited manpower and resources compared to local kingdoms and rival European powers. Over time, Portuguese settlements and fortresses created a fragile but far-reaching web, stretching from the shores of Mozambique and Goa to the tiny ports of Southeast Asia and the bustling markets of East Asia. This empire was never truly unified. Each outpost operated with a degree of independence, subject to local conditions and often improvising to survive. Yet through this loose network, Portugal projected its influence into the most lucrative markets of the world, controlling the flow of spices, silk, and precious goods to European markets, and building a legacy that would endure long after its naval supremacy began to fade. Thus, the establishment of Macau was not just another conquest, but a testament to Portuguese adaptability and ambition, a small foothold that connected Europe with the heart of Asia and exemplified the blend of commerce, missionary work, and martial prowess that defined Portugal's Eastern Empire. Brazil. Sugar, slaves, and the New World. In the year 1500, during the height of Portuguese exploration in the Indian Ocean, a fleet under the command of Pedro Álvares Cabral set out from Lisbon with the mission of reinforcing Portuguese positions in India. Blown westward by Atlantic currents, Cabral's ships sighted land far across the ocean, an immense coastline covered in dense forests and inhabited by indigenous peoples. On April 22, 1500, Cabral formally claimed this new land for the Portuguese crown, naming it Terra de Vera Cruz, land of the true cross. Though initially seen as a curiosity on the way to the richer markets of Asia, this vast territory would soon become central to Portugal's imperial ambitions. At first, the Portuguese crown paid little sustained attention to Brazil. The riches of the Indian Ocean trade, spices, gold, and precious stones, captured Lisbon's imagination, and Brazil seemed distant and of uncertain value. Early encounters with Brazil focused on extracting Brazil wood, a tree prized for its red dye used in European textiles. Private merchants and small expeditions set up rudimentary trading posts along the coast, bartering with indigenous peoples for timber, which was then shipped back to Europe. But by the mid-16th century, the Portuguese recognized the potential of Brazil's fertile lands and its mild, humid climate, ideal for cultivating sugarcane, a crop already transforming economies in Madeira and São Tomé. As global demand for sugar soared in Europe, Portuguese planters and investors began to establish permanent settlements and sugar mills, or engenhos, along Brazil's northeastern coast. Cities like Salvador, Olinda, and Recife grew from these plantations, their economies built on exporting sugar to European markets. The shift from scattered trading posts to organized colonization brought dramatic changes. Sugar production was labor-intensive and required a large, disciplined workforce. At first, Portuguese colonists attempted to enslave and exploit local indigenous populations, forcing them to work in fields and mills. But indigenous resistance, combined with devastating European diseases that decimated native communities, led colonists to look elsewhere for labor. Thus began the systematic importation of enslaved Africans into Brazil, a practice that would forever alter Brazilian society and fuel the growth of the colonial economy. By the late 16th century, Portuguese ships were transporting tens of thousands of captives from West and Central Africa to Brazil each year. These enslaved men, women, and children were sold in markets, forced to labor in brutal conditions on Exile plantations, and subjected to violence and coercion that became the backbone of the sugar industry. Over time, Brazil became the largest single destination for enslaved Africans in the Atlantic world. Historians estimate that nearly 5 million Africans were brought to Brazil between the 16th and 19th centuries, more than any other colony in the Americas. This massive forced migration transformed Brazil's demographic and cultural landscape. African languages, religious traditions, and customs blended with Portuguese culture and indigenous influences to create a complex, multicultural society that persists to this day. The wealth generated by sugar-enriched Portuguese merchants, colonial officials, and the crown, fueling further expansion in Brazil and providing resources to defend Portugal's interests in Asia and Africa. The Brazilian sugar trade became one of the key engines of the early modern global economy, linking plantation fields in the New World to merchant houses in Lisbon, financiers in Antwerp, and markets in London, Paris, and beyond. Yet the sugar boom came at immense human cost. The plantations were sites of relentless labor, disease, and mortality, where enslaved Africans faced appalling conditions, high death rates, and constant threat of punishment. Resistance was common through sabotage, escape, and revolt. Brazil's forests and interior fugitive communities known as quilombos sprang up, where escaped slaves forged new lives, defended their freedom, and resisted colonial authority. The Portuguese colonial administration, meanwhile, entrenched itself through networks of military outposts, fortified towns, and alliances with local elites. The Catholic Church also played a central role, establishing parishes, missions, and schools while simultaneously benefiting from slave labor and colonial wealth. Priests and missionaries sought to convert both indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans, though syncretic practices often blended Christianity with African and indigenous spiritual traditions. By the end of the 16th century, Brazil had shifted from a marginal outpost in Portugal's empire to its most valuable possession in the Americas, laying the groundwork for the complex colonial society that would dominate the next centuries of Brazilian history. The arrival of sugar and the mass enslavement of Africans were the defining engines of this transformation, forging a society marked by inequality, exploitation, and remarkable cultural fusion that remains at the heart of Brazil's identity. even today. As Portuguese colonization in Brazil accelerated through the mid-16th century, conflict and trade with indigenous peoples became central to the shaping of the colony's coastal regions. The Brazilian coast was dotted with hundreds of indigenous communities, each with its own language, customs, and political structures. The Portuguese often depended on these communities for survival in the early years, forging fragile alliances to secure food, labor, and local knowledge of the land. Yet these relationships were rarely balanced or peaceful for long. The Portuguese viewed the indigenous populations both as potential allies and as obstacles to expansion. In many areas, colonists engaged in trade with indigenous groups, exchanging iron tools, cloth, and beads for food, labor, and Brazilwood, the prized resource that had first drawn European interest to Brazil. Yet as the sugar economy expanded and the demand for plantation land and labor grew, Portuguese settlers began to push deeper into indigenous territories, seizing lands and attempting to enslave local populations. This expansion sparked violent conflict. Many indigenous communities fiercely resisted Portuguese incursions, using guerrilla tactics, strategic retreats, and alliances with rival European powers, particularly the French, who were eager to carve out their own footholds in Brazil. The Tupi and other coastal peoples saw in French traders potential partners against the growing power of the Portuguese. This fueled cycles of war, raiding, and shifting alliances that reshaped the demographic and political map of Brazil's coast. Meanwhile, the Portuguese crown and Catholic missionaries pursued campaigns of pacification, sending soldiers and priests into indigenous territories with the dual aim of conquest and conversion. Jesuit missionaries established aldeas, or mission villages, where they attempted to gather indigenous people under church authority, teach them European agricultural methods, and convert them to Catholicism. In theory, these missions were meant to protect indigenous communities from enslavement. In practice, they often became another arm of colonial control, breaking apart traditional structures and imposing foreign norms. Despite the violence and coercion, indigenous peoples played a crucial role in shaping Brazil's colonial economy and culture. They taught the Portuguese how to cultivate native crops, navigate rivers, and adapt to tropical climates. Indigenous knowledge of local environments became critical in hunting, fishing, and small-scale agriculture that fed growing settlements. Indigenous labor, sometimes coerced, sometimes negotiated, was also crucial in building early sugar mills and clearing forests for plantations. As the coastal conflicts and sugar industry expanded, Portuguese settlements like Salvador and Recife began to grow into bustling colonial towns. Founded in 1549 as the first colonial capital, Salvador, perched on the Bay of All Saints, quickly became the administrative and ecclesiastical center of Portuguese Brazil. Its protected harbor made it a natural point for unloading enslaved Africans, arriving on packed ships, and for exporting sugar, timber, and other colonial goods back to Europe. Salvador's streets filled with warehouses, churches, and the homes of colonial officials and wealthy planters. It became a focal point for the Portuguese slave trade in the South Atlantic, a place where cultures met, clashed, and blended, where European, African and indigenous traditions mixed in language, food, music, and religion. Farther south, Recife grew as a commercial port and center of sugar production. Built along a network of islands and waterways, Recife was ideally situated for trade and defense. By the late 16th century, it had become one of Brazil's key hubs, attracting merchants from across Europe. The wealth generated in Recife helped fuel not only the Portuguese crown's treasury, but also a growing class of colonial elites, planters, merchants, and officials who would increasingly dominate the social and political life of Brazil. These coastal towns became magnets for opportunity and sites of deep inequality. While Portuguese and mixed-race elites built stone houses and churches adorned with gold, the vast majority of the population, enslaved Africans and indigenous laborers, worked in brutal conditions in fields, mills, and ports. Epidemics periodically swept through crowded settlements, killing thousands and deepening cycles of poverty and exploitation. Yet even under such harsh conditions, cultural fusion flourished. African rhythms blended with European melodies, indigenous ingredients found their way into colonial kitchens, and languages and religious practices fused into something uniquely Brazilian. The early decades of colonization thus laid not only the economic foundations of Brazil's sugar-driven wealth, but also the cultural roots of a society that would continue to evolve under the pressures of conflict, trade, and migration. Battles at sea, rivals, pirates, and the Dutch challenge. In the 16th century, as Portugal's maritime empire stretched across the coasts of Africa, Asia, and Brazil, it faced mounting challenges from rival powers eager to break its hold over the seas. Chief among these early threats was the Ottoman Empire, whose own expansionist ambitions in the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, and Indian Ocean brought it into direct conflict with Portuguese fleets. The Ottomans, with their powerful navy based in Suez and their alliances with Muslim merchants across the Indian Ocean, saw the Portuguese as Christian intruders disrupting centuries-old Muslim-controlled trade routes that linked Egypt, Arabia, and India. Throughout the mid-1500s, the Ottomans launched a series of naval expeditions aimed at wresting control of strategic choke points from Portuguese hands. Battles flared in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, particularly around the fortress of Hormuz and the city of Aden. Portuguese ships, armed with superior artillery and built for oceanic endurance, clashed with Ottoman galleys that were faster and better suited for maneuvering in confined waters. Though the Portuguese often held their ground, they could never fully drive the Ottomans out of the region, and the struggle drained resources and manpower that Lisbon desperately needed elsewhere. While the Ottomans pushed from the west, a new threat arose in the north: the Dutch. In the late 16th century, the newly independent Dutch Republic, fueled by a combination of Protestant zeal, commercial ambition, and bitter rivalry with Catholic Spain and Portugal, launched a bold challenge to Portuguese control of the spice trade. In 1602, the Dutch founded the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, or Dutch East India Company, VOC, an enterprise backed by state power and private investors with the explicit goal of dominating the lucrative Asian trade. Unlike the Portuguese, who often relied on scattered fortresses and royal authority, the VOC operated with a cold, organized efficiency. They built powerful fleets, established fortified trading posts, and negotiated or forced alliances with local rulers, leveraging their economic and military might. Throughout the 17th century, the Dutch steadily displaced the Portuguese from key positions in Asia. In 1641, they captured Malacca, ending Portuguese dominance over the vital strait that linked the Indian and Pacific Oceans. They expelled the Portuguese from Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, and gradually took over the rich spice islands of the Moluccas, which had once been central to Portuguese profits. The Dutch not only seized Portuguese forts, but also undermined their trade networks. They imposed strict monopolies on spices like nutmeg, cloves, and mace, restricting access and waging brutal campaigns against local populations who resisted their control. Portuguese power, stretched thin across two oceans and undermined by corruption, bureaucratic delays, and underfunding from Lisbon, could not compete with the relentless drive and resources of the VOC. Simultaneously, English and French traders, too, began to encroach on Portuguese waters and outposts. The English East India Company, founded in 1600, sent ships into the Indian Ocean to compete for trade in pepper, silk, and other goods. Though initially smaller than the Dutch, the English gradually established footholds in India, where they would later build an empire of their own. The French, meanwhile, sought to establish colonies and trade in both Asia and the Atlantic, further eroding the once uncontested Portuguese presence. The seas that had once been dominated by the red-crossed sails of Portuguese caravels became battlegrounds filled with the flags of many nations. Piracy also flourished in these chaotic waters. Pirates and privateers, sometimes acting under official commission, sometimes for themselves, preyed on Portuguese convoys, sacking outposts and intercepting cargoes of spices, silver and gold. From the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, Portugal's long sea lanes became increasingly dangerous. This rising competition marked the beginning of a slow but irreversible decline in Portuguese maritime supremacy. The days when a single European power could dictate terms across half the world's oceans were ending, replaced by an era of fierce imperial rivalries. Portuguese forts, once symbols of unchallenged power, became isolated outposts besieged by newer, stronger forces. The dream of controlling the global spice trade faded as profits shifted to Dutch and English coffers. Yet the Portuguese legacy endured in ports, charts, and cultural exchanges that had transformed the world. The battles they fought at sea in the 16th and 17th centuries reshaped global trade, laying the groundwork for the modern, interconnected world of commerce, conflict, and shifting empires that would define the centuries to come. Gold, diamonds, and inland Brazil. In the waning years of the 17th century, the rugged hills of Minas Gerais transformed from a scarcely settled wilderness into the epicenter of a new era in Brazil's history. The discovery of gold in this interior region in the 1690s sparked a feverish rush that drew thousands from across the colony and beyond. What began as scattered rumors of gold in riverbeds soon became undeniable, as prospectors pulled gleaming grains and nuggets from the soil, fueling dreams of instant fortune. The Portuguese crown, weary from European wars and eager to replenish, Its treasury saw in Brazil's goldfields a lifeline. Administrators quickly imposed order, levying the royal quinto, a tax claiming 1/5 of all gold mined. Foundries were established where miners were required to melt their finds into bars stamped with official seals before shipment to coastal ports. Despite this oversight, smuggling flourished, with illicit networks developing to hide and transport untaxed gold down treacherous paths, guarded by armed escorts wary of both bandits and royal patrols. At the heart of the rush rose towns like Vila Rica, which would later be known as Ouro Preto. Here, makeshift shanties gave way to stone buildings, ornate churches, and cobbled streets crowded with mule trains hauling tools, supplies, and enslaved Africans forced into the brutal labor of extraction. The mining boom created an insatiable demand for food, cloth, iron tools, and imported luxuries, sparking the rapid development of trade routes between the coast and interior. Rio de Janeiro, once a modest port overshadowed by Salvador, grew into the colony's primary commercial and administrative hub, its wharves crowded with ships ferrying Brazil's gold to Lisbon. In the early 18th century, fortune struck again, this time in the form of diamonds. Near the town of Diamantina, prospectors discovered sparkling stones glinting in streambeds. Unlike gold, which was mined by countless small operators, the Crown swiftly established a tight monopoly over diamond production. Special districts were created where only royal contractors could legally extract and trade diamonds, guarded by soldiers determined to stamp out smuggling. The diamond boom further enriched the Portuguese treasury, providing new revenue streams for courtly luxuries, palatial construction projects, and European wars. In Lisbon, gold and diamond shipments underwrote the grand ambitions of monarchs eager to display Portugal's enduring wealth and influence, but the price was high. In the mines, enslaved Africans bore the brunt of this prosperity, forced to work in dangerous pits and river channels under constant threat of punishment, disease, and death. The population shift into Minas Gerais fundamentally changed Brazil's social landscape. A new class of powerful merchants and mine owners emerged, their fortunes often surpassing those of the old coastal sugar barons. Architects and artists followed the money, building lavish Baroque churches adorned with gilded altars, intricate woodwork, and murals that blended European motifs with local imagination. Alongside these displays of piety and wealth grew taverns, gambling halls, and markets where deals were struck and fortunes lost overnight. Indigenous peoples suffered immensely during this period, pushed further from their ancestral lands by settlers hungry for gold, while diseases and violence took a heavy toll. At the same time, resistance simmered beneath the surface. Some enslaved Africans escaped to form communities of fugitives in the hinterlands, while occasional riots and revolts flared in the gold towns against harsh taxes and crown control. By the mid-18th century, the center of Portuguese Brazil had clearly shifted from the coast to the interior. Rio de Janeiro, fed by mineral wealth, became the colony's political and economic capital, eclipsing Salvador and consolidating royal authority in the south. The gold and diamond rushes did not just enrich the crown, they bound Brazil's fate more tightly to Portugal, creating a powerful engine that sustained the empire well into the modern age. Yet even amid this era of glittering wealth, the seeds of future conflict and change were being sown in the restless hills of Minas Gerais. As the gold and diamond boom swept through Minas Gerais and surrounding regions, the Portuguese crown faced a new reality. Immense wealth was flowing out of Brazil, but so too were tensions, smuggling, and local power struggles that threatened Lisbon's control. To protect its lucrative colonial interests, the monarchy expanded and centralized the colonial administration, tightening its grip on the mining districts and shifting the entire structure of governance in Brazil. In the early decades of the Exile, 18th century royal officials flooded into Minas Gerais, setting up new administrative posts, courts, and tax offices. The Crown established foundries in key towns, casas de fundição, where miners were legally required to bring their gold for smelting and stamping. This was both a means of collecting the royal quinto tax and of enforcing the Crown's monopoly on legitimate trade. Troops patrolled mountain passes and roads to the coast, charged with intercepting smugglers and protecting convoys of gold-laden mule trains bound for ports like Rio de Janeiro. Local authorities, often appointed directly from Lisbon, were granted sweeping powers to adjudicate disputes, resolve claims over mining rights, and punish those accused of withholding taxes or breaking Crown regulations. Governors and magistrates operated with wide latitude, wielding both civil and military authority to keep order in the chaotic, rapidly growing mining centers. In Vila Rica and other boomtowns, colonial courts became crowded with cases over theft, property disputes, and accusations of tax evasion, reflecting the volatile, high-stakes world of the gold rush economy. This expansion of state machinery was not limited to policing and taxation. The Crown also invested in infrastructure to sustain the flow of wealth from the interior. Roads were widened and improved, bridges built over rivers, and way stations constructed where troops, officials, and merchants could rest and resupply. The main route from Minas Gerais to Rio de Janeiro, known as the Caminho Novo, became a lifeline lined with inns, warehouses, and fortified checkpoints. These efforts were not purely administrative. They also signaled the Crown's intent to impose a more direct, paternalistic rule over the colony, an effort to ensure that the new inland elite of mine owners and merchants remained loyal to Lisbon. In this period, Brazil began to look less like a loose confederation of coastal captaincies and more like a unified colony with a centralized bureaucracy focused on extracting mineral wealth for the benefit of the metropole. The steady flow of gold and diamonds did more than just fill Portugal's treasury. It fueled a broader European appetite for luxury goods. As Brazilian gold poured into Lisbon, it was quickly spent on foreign imports: fine cloth from England, porcelain and tea from China, spices and silks from India, and weapons from the arsenals of France and the Netherlands. Portugal itself was too small and too lightly industrialized to meet the growing demands of its elite, so its colonial riches essentially underwrote its trade deficits with more advanced European economies. In palaces from Lisbon to Paris, Brazilian gold leaf adorned church altars, framed royal portraits, and was minted into coins bearing the arms of the Portuguese crown. Diamond-studded jewelry from Brazil decorated the necks and fingers of Europe's aristocracy, The flow of precious stones was so substantial that it helped set fashion trends in London, Madrid, and Vienna, transforming European tastes and fueling the insatiable hunger for new displays of opulence. Yet this golden age also carried seeds of tension. Portuguese merchants and officials grew rich off imperial trade networks, but local resentment simmered among miners and settlers in Brazil, who felt choked by high taxes and crown monopolies. At the same time, the demands of European markets placed unrelenting pressure on Brazil's mining economy, leading to harsher conditions for enslaved Africans and more violent displacement of indigenous peoples. By the middle of the 18th century, the Portuguese crown had succeeded in turning Brazil's inland mineral wealth into the backbone of its imperial might. But beneath the surface of royal authority and European splendor, a restless, resentful society was taking shape in the hills of Minas Gerais, one that would soon begin to challenge the structures of colonial rule that Lisbon had built to secure its golden empire. Decline in Asia, persistence in Brazil. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, Portugal's once vast Asian empire began to shrink under the combined pressures of rising European rivals and increasingly assertive local powers. What had been an ambitious network of forts, trading posts, and maritime routes stretching from the coast of India to the islands of Southeast Asia now faced steady disintegration. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, backed by powerful investors and a centralized trading strategy, aggressively moved against Portuguese possessions. In 1641, they seized Malacca, cutting Portugal off from one of the most vital choke points in the Asian spice trade. In the Moluccas, the Dutch displaced Portuguese outposts, ending Lisbon's monopoly over valuable cloves and nutmeg. By the mid-17th century, the Dutch had also driven Portugal out of Ceylon, further eroding their once dominant presence in South Asia. The British, too, expanded steadily, establishing fortified trading posts in India that undercut Portugal's older treaties and privileges. Their growing naval strength and alliances with local Indian states allowed them to outmaneuver the Portuguese, who often lacked the resources and unified command to resist effectively. Meanwhile, the Maratha Confederacy, the Mughal Empire, and numerous coastal sultanates in Southeast Asia learned to exploit European rivalries, squeezing Portuguese outposts with demands for tribute or by forging ties with the Dutch and British. Despite these mounting challenges, Portugal did not vanish entirely from Asia. Goa, although a shadow of its 16th century splendor, remained under Portuguese control through cautious diplomacy and periodic shows of military force. It retained a small administrative structure and religious institutions, but could no longer dictate regional trade as it once had. Macau, on the southern coast of China, survived by balancing carefully between Chinese imperial authorities and shifting European rivalries. Though never entirely secure, it continued as a small but steady trade hub, linking China with European markets. On the fringes of Southeast Asia, Timor stayed under Portuguese control, mostly ignored by other colonial powers, and providing a minor outpost for trade in sandalwood and other local goods. This steady erosion of Asian possessions reflected deeper structural weaknesses in the Portuguese Empire. Overextended and often embroiled in European conflicts, Portugal could not marshal the financial or naval power to defend far-flung territories. The rise of joint stock companies like the VOC and British East India Company, which pooled private capital to fund enormous commercial and military ventures, gave rival powers a decisive edge in the competitive markets of Asia. Portuguese trade networks, once pioneering and nimble, had become cumbersome and bureaucratic, unable to adapt quickly to the fast-changing political and economic realities of the region. Amid this decline in Asia, Portugal increasingly turned its focus westward to Brazil. The discovery of gold and diamonds in the interior of Brazil shifted royal attention across the Atlantic. Lisbon's ministers poured resources into fortifying Brazil's ports, building roads to connect mining towns, and tightening administrative control to ensure a steady flow of mineral wealth. While Asian outposts shrank or fell away, Brazil grew into the center of Portuguese imperial ambition, generating the revenue needed to sustain the monarchy's prestige and operations in Europe. Thus, by the late 18th century, Portugal maintained only a tenuous hold on Goa, Macau, and Timor in Asia, symbols of a fading age of exploration and maritime empire. Their real strategic weight had diminished, eclipsed by the wealth flowing from Brazil and the growing challenge of managing internal unrest and rival European interests in the Atlantic world. The empire's center had shifted decisively, reflecting a profound transformation in Portuguese global priorities and setting the stage for the turbulent era of revolutions and independence movements that lay ahead. As the 17th century faded into the 18th, the shifting currents of empire led Portugal to focus more than ever on Brazil, which had become the undeniable center of its economic survival and political attention. With Asian possessions steadily slipping away to better financed, more aggressive European rivals like the Dutch and British, Portugal no longer had the capacity, or sometimes even the will, to defend far-flung forts and trading posts that had once been its pride. Instead, Lisbon increasingly looked west to the vast and resource-rich colony of Brazil, whose gold, diamonds, sugar and timber had become the primary source of royal wealth and Portugal's standing in Europe. The discovery of gold in Minas Gerais and the diamond finds further inland transformed Brazil's economy and society. Gold fever drove settlers and adventurers into the interior, while Lisbon imposed heavy taxes and built roads and fortified posts to control and protect the flow of wealth. This economic shift pulled the colonial population away from coastal sugar plantations and ports, pushing the frontier deeper into indigenous lands. Rio de Janeiro grew rapidly, eclipsing older centers like Salvador and becoming the nerve center for colonial administration and transatlantic trade. For Portugal, struggling to maintain influence in Europe and support a monarchy often riven by internal disputes, Brazil became not just a lucrative colony, but the foundation of the empire's global identity. This intense focus on Brazil created new tensions within the colony. By the mid-18th century, a distinct class of Brazilian-born elites, landowners, merchants, clergy and officials had emerged, wealthy and influential but resentful of Portuguese-born bureaucrats and Lisbon's rigid mercantile policies. These elites built grand estates, invested in local infrastructure, and developed social networks rooted in the colony rather than the distant mother country. They began to see themselves not merely as subjects of Portugal, but as leaders in their own right, with interests often at odds with the crown's. Though loyalty to the Portuguese monarch remained outwardly strong, these Brazilian-born elites increasingly agitated for local control over taxes, trade policy and governance. Tensions simmered in conspiracies and small uprisings, like the Inconfidencia Mineira in the 1780s, a failed plot by Brazilian landowners and intellectuals who dreamed of creating an independent republic modelled on American ideals. Although Portugal suppressed such movements harshly, they marked a turning point, revealing how the crown's reliance on Brazil's wealth had created a confident, restless class of colonials who were no longer content to be treated as mere subjects of Lisbon's imperial designs. Yet despite growing calls for autonomy, the Portuguese language and culture remained firmly entrenched in Brazil. Portuguese law, Catholic religious institutions, and social customs shaped daily life from Rio de Janeiro to the hinterlands of Minas Gerais. Portuguese remained the language of commerce, administration, and literature. Colonial schools, though, often run by the church, reinforced ties to European norms and values, even as they created an educated class that would eventually question Lisbon's authority. Culturally, the Portuguese imprint could be seen everywhere. In city architecture with tiled churches and Baroque mansions, in the codified legal traditions that governed inheritance and property, and in the enduring hierarchy of social and racial classes built around the plantation economy. Portuguese cuisine, dress, festivals, and religious observances blended with indigenous and African traditions, creating the hybrid culture that would become Brazil's hallmark. Even as Asian territories slipped away, these cultural and linguistic bonds preserved the notion of a unified Portuguese world, stretching across the Atlantic rather than the Indian Ocean. By the end of the 18th century, Portugal's empire had been redefined. Where once Lisbon had dreamed of ruling seas from Goa to Malacca, it now rested its hopes and future on the flow of gold, sugar, and diamonds from Brazil. In doing so, Portugal unwittingly set the stage for a new era, one where the very strength and confidence of its colonial subjects would become the seeds of independent struggles and the unraveling of the empire that had begun centuries earlier with the voyages of Prince Henry's explorers. Napoleon, Brazil, and the Portuguese caught in exile. In 1807, as Napoleon's armies swept across Europe, Portugal found itself in the path of an unstoppable tide. The French emperor, eager to enforce his continental system against Britain and punish any who defied it, ordered the invasion of Portugal after the Portuguese crown refused to sever trade ties with the British. Facing overwhelming French forces, the Portuguese royal family made a historic decision: to abandon Lisbon and flee across the Atlantic to their prized colony of Brazil. In a scene unprecedented in European history, the monarchy packed its treasures, court officials, and entire administrative apparatus onto British ships and sailed for Rio de Janeiro, seeking safety in the New World. This exodus transformed Brazil overnight. On arrival in Rio in early 1808, Prince Regent João, later King João VI, established his government in the city, effectively turning Rio into the capital of the Portuguese Empire. Grand houses and churches were commandeered to house the royal entourage, and the colonial city, once seen by Lisbon as a distant outpost, now became the nerve center of a global empire. This dramatic shift upended centuries of colonial hierarchy. Brazil was no longer a subject territory ruled from afar. It was the seat of the monarchy itself, a vital center of power that absorbed European court culture, politics, and bureaucracy. The presence of the court unleashed a flurry of reforms and changes that would reshape Brazil forever. Freed from old colonial restrictions, Prince Regent João lifted trade monopolies that had bound Brazilian commerce to Lisbon for centuries. Brazilian ports were open to friendly nations, particularly Britain, ushering in a wave of foreign merchants, goods and ideas. British manufacturers flooded Brazilian markets, while Brazilian agricultural products, sugar, coffee, cotton, found eager buyers abroad. This economic liberalization spurred growth in industry and commerce, creating new fortunes and strengthening the hand of local elites eager to modernize. Beyond trade, the arrival of the court ignited cultural and educational transformation. The first printing press in Brazil was established in Rio de Janeiro in 1808, ending centuries of Portuguese censorship that had forbidden presses in the colony. New schools, libraries, and institutions sprang up to serve the royal court and the growing bureaucracy. Medical schools were founded. Theatres staged European plays, and Rio itself was beautified with public buildings, gardens, and monuments in an effort to match the grandeur of European capitals. The royal court's move also had diplomatic ramifications. Brazil became a crucial ally to Britain, whose navy had ensured the safe passage of the Portuguese fleet and whose merchants now dominated trade in Brazilian ports. In return, the British secured advantageous commercial treaties and strengthened their foothold in South American affairs. Meanwhile, Napoleon's occupation of Portugal fueled years of conflict in Europe, turning the old kingdom into a backwater while its royal family and treasures lay safely ensconced in Rio. This period of exile not only rescued the Portuguese monarchy from collapse, but also elevated Brazil's position within the empire to heights it had never before imagined. For the first time, the colony had direct access to the machinery of royal governance. Brazilian-born elites, long resentful of being treated as second-class subjects, now maneuvered in court politics, secured titles, and gained influence. New ministries and agencies were established to manage the expanding colonial bureaucracy, staffed increasingly by locals who viewed Brazil's future as intertwined with royal policy rather than as a mere appendage to distant Lisbon. These transformations would have far-reaching consequences. Economic liberalization empowered Brazilian planters and merchants who had once chafed under Lisbon's mercantilist system. The new cultural and political institutions seeded a local elite confident in its own power and importance, and perhaps most significantly, the very act of shifting the monarchy to Brazil dissolved old assumptions about Europe's inherent superiority, laying the psychological foundation for the independence movement that would soon erupt across the South American continent. The presence of the Portuguese court in Rio de Janeiro not only transformed the colony's economy and institutions, but also elevated a new class of Brazilian-born elites who would play a pivotal role in the colony's path toward independence. As Prince Regent João and his entourage set up their imperial government in Brazil, they relied increasingly on local planters, merchants and bureaucrats to help manage the sprawling territory and ensure the steady flow of wealth needed to sustain the royal court and ongoing wars in Europe. This reliance broke old taboos that had kept Brazilian-born subjects at arm's length from meaningful political power, and fostered a climate in which local elites began to see themselves not merely as colonial subordinates, but as partners in empire. Brazilian sugar barons, coffee planters, and merchants who had once been bound by tight Lisbon-imposed trade restrictions now flourished under the liberalized economic policies of the court in exile. Many grew rich, exporting commodities directly to Britain and other European markets, bypassing the old bureaucratic bottlenecks that had long funneled colonial trade through Portuguese ports. In exchange for their support and loyalty, João granted titles, honors, and administrative positions to prominent Brazilian-born families, knitting them into the royal network and giving them a taste of the power previously monopolized by Portuguese-born aristocrats. The court's move also brought new institutions that further empowered the local elite. Law courts, universities, and guilds established during this period became training grounds for a generation of Brazilian-born lawyers, clerics, and officials who would come to view Brazil not as a mere colony, but as the rightful center of the Portuguese-speaking world. The press, too, gained a foothold, with newspapers and pamphlets discussing trade, policy, and European political developments that might previously have been censored by colonial authorities. This intellectual awakening helped create a shared sense of Brazilian identity among the educated classes. In this environment, the seeds of autonomy quietly took root. Though outwardly loyal to the monarchy, many Brazilian-born elites grew to resent continued interference by Portuguese-born bureaucrats and military officers who still saw Brazil as a subordinate territory. Tensions flared in debates over taxation, trade monopolies, and governance, as local leaders argued for greater autonomy in managing the colony's expanding economy and population. They began to envision a future in which Brazil might govern itself, free from the shifting crises of European wars and the dictates of distant Lisbon. Meanwhile, the experience of hosting the monarchy imbued Brazil with a confidence and institutional maturity lacking in other colonies. By the 1810s, Rio de Janeiro had become the beating heart of an empire that spanned the Atlantic, complete with royal palaces, government ministries, foreign embassies, and a thriving commercial sector. The Brazilian elite saw themselves as guardians of this newfound prestige, committed to maintaining Brazil's prosperity, even as Europe was plunged into chaos by Napoleon's wars. When Napoleon was finally defeated in 1815 and the monarchy elevated Brazil's status to a co-equal kingdom within a united Portuguese-Brazilian empire, it seemed a victory for local elites. But the return of the Portuguese court to Lisbon in 1821 reignited old tensions. Many Brazilians feared that hard-won privileges and reforms would be rolled back. Their confidence, wealth, and experience in governance, built during the court's stay in Rio, now turned toward defending local interests against renewed Portuguese centralization. Thus, the rise of the Brazilian-born elite class tied to the monarchy and trade laid the groundwork for independence. They had built fortunes under royal patronage, developed sophisticated political institutions, and nurtured a distinct identity grounded in Brazil's unique colonial experience. When conflict with Lisbon inevitably came, it was this class, wealthy, powerful, and increasingly self-assured, that would lead the push for sovereignty, rallying around Dom Pedro, the son of João VI, to declare Brazil's independence in 1822. Brazilian independence and the loss of the crown jewel. The events of 1822 marked one of the most pivotal turning points in Portuguese history, a moment when Portugal lost its largest, richest, and most vital colony with remarkably little bloodshed, forever altering the trajectory of the empire. In the years following the return of King João VI to Lisbon in 1821, tensions simmered between Portugal and Brazil. The Brazilian-born elites, who had grown accustomed to increased autonomy and royal patronage during the years of the court's residence in Rio de Janeiro, resisted any attempts by Lisbon to reassert tighter colonial control. At the heart of the drama stood Dom Pedro, the son of João VI. Left behind in Brazil as regent, Dom Pedro found himself under pressure from both Portuguese authorities demanding his return to Lisbon, and from Brazilian leaders who feared a rollback of the political gains and economic freedoms won during the previous decade. Influential planters, merchants, and intellectuals urged Dom Pedro to remain in Brazil and stand against the growing tide of Portuguese centralization. On September 7, 1822, Dom Pedro responded with a bold act that would define Brazilian nationhood. He declared Brazil's independence from Portugal on the banks of the Ipiranga River, famously proclaiming, "Independence or death." Within months, he was crowned Emperor Dom Pedro III of Brazil, signaling the birth of a new nation that would chart its own path while maintaining monarchical traditions that felt familiar to its ruling class. Unlike many other struggles for independence across Latin America, Brazil's break from Portugal was notable for its relative lack of widespread violence. Though there were pockets of conflict and local resistance, especially in the northern provinces, the transition was remarkably swift and often negotiated rather than fought on open battlefields. This was due in large part to the alignment of interests among Brazilian elites, who viewed Dom Pedro as a stabilizing figure capable of safeguarding their wealth and influence while avoiding the chaotic republican revolutions sweeping Spanish America. For Portugal, however, the loss of Brazil was devastating. The colony had been the crown jewel of the empire, its vast territory and booming economy sustaining Portugal's treasury and propping up its position among Europe's powers. The steady flow of gold, diamonds, sugar, coffee, and other resources that had once underwritten royal extravagance and paid foreign debts now slipped beyond Lisbon's reach. Almost overnight, Portugal found itself an empire in decline, forced to reckon with shrinking revenues and a reduced geopolitical stature. The economic shock reverberated through Portuguese society. Trade networks that had linked Lisbon to Rio, Bahia, and Minas Gerais withered, and Portuguese merchants who had depended on Brazilian commerce faced ruin. The monarchy, already weakened by years of European wars and internal strife, struggled to adapt to the new reality. Political turmoil soon followed. Liberal and absolutist factions clashed bitterly over how to govern a nation now bereft of its greatest source of wealth, leading to constitutional struggles, coups, and periodic bouts of civil conflict throughout the 19th century. The trauma of losing Brazil exposed deeper rifts within Portuguese society. Many in the aristocracy and merchant class had grown wealthy on Brazilian trade, while others in the emerging liberal movement saw the independence crisis as proof of the monarchy's failures. Calls for reform intensified, challenging old privileges and seeking to modernize Portuguese institutions to survive in a changing world. Yet despite the loss, Portugal clung to its remaining colonial possessions, especially in Africa, and looked for ways to revive its fortunes through new ventures. But the age of Portuguese imperial dominance, so spectacularly launched in the 15th and 16th centuries, had ended. The departure of Brazil was more than the loss of a colony. It was the collapse of a centuries-old imperial dream, leaving Portugal to grapple with a diminished role on the world stage and a struggle to redefine its national identity amid a turbulent 19th century. Even as Brazil broke politically from Portugal in 1822, the ties between colony and former metropole endured in ways that would echo across generations. Brazilian society, especially among the elite classes, retained deep cultural, legal and linguistic connections to Portugal, which helped cushion the abruptness of political separation and contributed to a relatively stable transition into an independent empire rather than a volatile republic. Portuguese remained the language of law, commerce and literature in Brazil, embedding itself even more firmly as a unifying feature of the vast new nation. Portuguese legal codes and administrative traditions, transplanted and modified during centuries of colonial rule, continued to guide Brazil's courts and bureaucracies long after independence was declared. Culturally, too, the links were persistent. The Catholic Church, which had been a pillar of Portuguese colonial governance, retained its authority and structure in Brazil, shaping education, public festivals, and social norms well into the imperial period and beyond. The influence of Portuguese architecture, cuisine, and customs continued to permeate Brazilian cities from Salvador to Rio de Janeiro, while a steady flow of Portuguese immigrants kept familial and economic connections alive between the two shores of the Atlantic. For Portugal, this lingering bond with Brazil was both a comfort and a painful reminder of what had been lost. Lisbon merchants, struggling in the wake of independence, often found ways to re-establish trade ties under the new Brazilian government, exporting manufactured goods and importing Brazilian coffee, sugar and hides. Meanwhile, thousands of Portuguese migrants seeking opportunity continued to cross the Atlantic, filling Brazil's expanding cities and helping build its growing commercial and port infrastructure. Thus, while the Portuguese crown had lost its sovereign grip over Brazil, the everyday connections of trade, family and faith endured, weaving the two societies together in patterns more complex than simple colonial subjugation. The loss of Brazil also signaled an undeniable shift in Portugal's imperial identity. What had once been a sprawling global network, stretching from Asian ports like Goa and Macau to South America's vast interior, contracted suddenly into a patchwork of disconnected colonies. Portugal's imperial gaze turned increasingly toward Africa, where holdings in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and scattered Atlantic islands became the new focus of expansionist ambition. But these African colonies, plagued by resistance, harsh climates, and logistical challenges, could never replace Brazil's vast mineral wealth and agricultural riches. This transition marked the end of Portugal's era as a globe-spanning empire and the beginning of a more constrained, defensive imperial posture. The royal court and Lisbon's elites turned inward, seeking to hold on to what remained of the colonial world rather than dream of new maritime conquests. The image of Portugal as a pioneering navigator and trailblazer faded, replaced by the harsher realities of colonial maintenance, competition with stronger European powers, and growing scrutiny from abolitionist movements and liberal critics at home. Domestically, the shift from global empire to fragmented colonial possession fueled intense debate about Portugal's future. Some conservative factions clung to visions of renewed imperial glory, while liberals increasingly argued that Portugal's survival lay in modernizing its economy and political institutions rather than pinning its hopes on distant colonies. The trauma of losing Brazil exposed deep fault lines in Portuguese society, sparking constitutional struggles, civil wars, and rising calls for reform. In the years that followed, Portugal would continue to extract resources and labor from its African colonies, often through brutal methods that sowed seeds of resistance and future conflict. Yet the ghost of Brazil, its wealth, its promise, and its seemingly effortless slip from Portugal's grasp, hung over the empire like a permanent reminder of lost greatness. The Portuguese language, once spread by navigators and conquistadors across 4 continents, endured in Brazil as the clearest symbol of a shared past, even as the political bonds between Lisbon and Rio crumbled forever. Africa in the 19th century, Scramble and resistance. In the 19th century, as Europe plunged into the frenzied race known as the Scramble for Africa, Portugal moved to expand its grip over the African territories it had long claimed but never fully controlled. Angola and Mozambique, vast regions that had seen Portuguese trading posts and slaving forts since the 16th century, became focal points of renewed imperial ambition. Lisbon, wary of being sidelined by more powerful colonial competitors like Britain, France, and Germany, pushed deeper into Africa's interior, establishing outposts, forging treaties with local chiefs, and launching military expeditions designed to map, conquer, and administratively control these territories. This expansion was not uncontested. Across Angola and Mozambique, powerful African kingdoms and communities fiercely resisted Portuguese intrusion. In Angola, the Mbundu and Ovimbundu peoples, who had built complex political and trading systems over centuries, refused to cede land and sovereignty without a fight. Raids, ambushes, and drawn-out wars characterized the Portuguese advance, turning the hinterlands into contested zones rather than secure colonies. Similarly, in Mozambique, the Gaza Empire under leaders like Ngungunyane marshaled significant resistance, waging protracted campaigns against Portuguese incursions and disrupting trade routes that Lisbon sought to dominate. For Portugal, these wars were costly and often demoralizing. Troops suffered not just from African opposition, but from disease, logistical nightmares, and chronic underfunding. Portuguese officials in Luanda and Lourenço Marques, modern-day Maputo, pleaded with Lisbon for reinforcements and supplies, while back in Portugal, debates raged over the wisdom of pouring resources into distant territories at a time of domestic instability and economic stagnation. Meanwhile, the growing strength of the European anti-slavery movement cast a long shadow over Portugal's African enterprises. For centuries, the transatlantic slave trade had been a cornerstone of Portuguese wealth, with tens of thousands of enslaved Africans shipped from Angola and Mozambique to plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean. But as Britain, France, and other European powers outlawed slavery and pressured others to follow suit, Portugal found itself increasingly isolated and criticized for clinging to the trade in human beings. Treaties signed under British duress forced Portugal to gradually curtail the export of slaves by the mid-19th century, though clandestine networks continued for decades. This shift shook Portugal's colonial economy to its core. Slave trading companies collapsed, coastal forts were abandoned, and plantation owners scrambled to adapt to a world where forced labor, at least in theory, could no longer underpin profit. In its place, Portuguese authorities began to promote alternative forms of exploitation, such as so-called contract labor, which in practice often replicated the brutal conditions of slavery under a new name. Still, the tide was turning. International pressure and domestic criticism made it increasingly difficult for Lisbon to defend the slave trade, as the moral consensus in Europe shifted decisively against it. Even as the slave trade receded, resistance across Africa continued. In Angola, uprisings broke out repeatedly through the late 19th century as Portuguese forces attempted to build roads, levy taxes, and station permanent garrisons. In Mozambique, repeated wars against Nguni-led states and Swahili-speaking coastal traders drained Lisbon's treasury and stretched its military thin. Each village pacified was another that needed fortifying. Every treaty signed was liable to collapse under local opposition the moment Portuguese troops withdrew. The Portuguese government, weak at home and buffeted by political revolutions and changing monarchs, often lacked the capacity to fully secure its imperial ambitions. But the scramble among European powers gave Portugal an urgent reason to press on. If it did not claim and hold territory, rivals would. Maps became diplomatic weapons, as Lisbon dispatched explorers and surveyors into Africa's interior to draw borders before the British or Germans could do the same. By the century's end, Portugal had extended nominal control over broad swaths of Angola and Mozambique, at least on paper. But the cost was enormous, both in human lives and in Portugal's fragile national budget. And beneath the thin surface of colonial rule, African resistance smoldered, ready to flare up whenever the colonial grip weakened. Thus, the 19th century was an era of expansion, but also of unending conflict, as Portugal struggled to hold on to its empire in a rapidly changing world. The empire ends, but the sea remembers. In 1974, a quiet revolution in Portugal transformed the country overnight and set in motion the rapid dismantling of its centuries-old colonial empire. Known as the Carnation Revolution, this near-bloodless coup was led by disillusioned Portuguese military officers weary of the endless colonial wars that had drained the nation's resources and morale. For over a decade, Portugal had been locked in brutal conflicts across Africa, battling independence movements in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. These wars, known collectively as the Portuguese Colonial War, consumed the country's youth and budget, sowing discontent among soldiers and civilians alike. On April 25, 1974, tanks rolled into Lisbon, but instead of gunfire, civilians poured into the streets, placing carnations in the barrels of soldiers' rifles. The dictatorship that had ruled Portugal for nearly half a century collapsed almost overnight, swept away by a tide of popular support for democracy, freedom, and an end to colonial conflict. In the heady months that followed, a new civilian government took power, promising not just reforms at home, but also a complete rethinking of Portugal's role abroad. At the heart of this new vision was decolonization. The wars in Africa, which had claimed tens of thousands of lives, were brought to an immediate halt. Negotiations began with liberation movements that had fought Lisbon's rule for years, often with backing from the Soviet Union and neighboring African states. Within months, treaties were signed, and the Portuguese flag was lowered over vast territories that had once been the jewels of the empire. In 1975, Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau officially gained independence. These transitions were often chaotic and marred by violence, as rival factions within the newly liberated countries struggled for power. In Angola and Mozambique, civil wars erupted almost immediately, fueled by Cold War rivalries and deep divisions, left by decades of colonial rule. Portugal, exhausted and economically weak, could offer little support or guidance, focusing instead on rebuilding democracy at home. The end of empire was a wrenching adjustment for Portugal. For centuries, the notion of overseas colonies had been entwined with national identity. From the era of Prince Henry the Navigator and Vasco da Gama to the sugar plantations of Brazil and the diamond mines of Angola, the empire had given Portugal a sense of global significance that belied its small size and limited natural resources. Suddenly, that imperial scaffolding was gone, replaced by a humbler, uncertain future within Europe. Yet the end of political control did not erase the cultural and human bonds that had formed over centuries. Millions of Portuguese settlers returned from Africa, known as retornados, bringing with them stories, customs, and memories that would reshape Portugal's society. In the newly independent countries, Portuguese remained a lingua franca, connecting diverse ethnic groups and forming the basis of new national identities. Lusophone culture, rooted in shared language, religion, and history, continued to flourish in literature, music, and commerce, even as formal ties dissolved. The Carnation Revolution thus marked both an ending and a beginning, the final chapter in an imperial story that had started 5 centuries earlier, and the first steps toward a new identity grounded not in conquest, but in democracy, diplomacy, and a shared Atlantic heritage. The sea, which had once carried Portuguese explorers to every corner of the globe, remained a symbol of possibility, a reminder of the nation's past and a guidepost for its future. In the years following the Carnation Revolution of 1974, Portugal faced the daunting task of redefining itself. The revolution, which had ended decades of authoritarian rule, and triggered rapid decolonization, left the country politically, economically, and socially adrift. No longer an imperial power ruling vast overseas territories, Portugal was forced to look inward, to rebuild its institutions, economy, and identity as a European nation rather than a colonial empire. This transition was neither smooth nor immediate. The sudden withdrawal from Africa, coupled with the return of nearly 1 million Portuguese settlers, known as retornados, placed immense strain on housing, jobs, and public services. Yet the democratic movement that swept the country in the mid-1970s fostered a new political culture built on multi-party elections, constitutional protections, and civil liberties. In 1976, Portugal ratified a new democratic constitution, and over the next decade, successive governments slowly stabilized the economy, expanded education and healthcare, and dismantled the vestiges of the authoritarian Estado Novo regime at the same time Portugal reoriented itself towards Europe. In 1986, it joined the European Economic Community, later the European Union, marking a decisive step away from the old colonial framework and towards integration with its European neighbours. EU membership brought investment, infrastructure, projects and regulatory reforms, helping modernise Portuguese industry and agriculture while boosting living standards across the country. Though challenges remained, by the early 21st century, Portugal had completed its transformation from a fading imperial state into a stable European democracy. Yet even as the empire vanished, Portugal's legacy endured in unexpected ways. Across the Atlantic and in Africa, millions continued to speak Portuguese, preserving the language as a common thread linking diverse peoples and cultures. In Brazil, Portuguese remained not only the official language, but a vital part of national identity woven into literature, music, law, and daily life. In former African colonies like Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and Cape Verde, Portuguese became a lingua franca, used in government, education, and trade, despite the persistence of indigenous languages and cultures. Beyond language, the Baintiau Portuguese legacy persisted in legal systems and cultural practices. The codified laws, municipal frameworks, and colonial administrative traditions Portugal left behind provided a foundation, however imperfect, for many newly independent nations to build upon. Culinary traditions too reflected this shared heritage, with dishes, spices, and preparation styles tracing their roots to Portuguese colonial kitchens, adapted and transformed across continents. Back in Portugal, the maritime tradition that had launched the Age of Discovery remained a source of national pride. In literature, art, and public monuments, the memory of seafarers, explorers, and navigators continued to shape Portuguese identity. Museums, maritime academies, and naval institutions preserved this history, emphasizing Portugal's unique role as a bridge between continents and cultures. Annual festivals celebrated explorers like Vasco da Gama and Ferdinand Magellan, not as conquerors, but as daring navigators who connected distant worlds. In this way, the sea remained central to the Portuguese sense of self. Though the empire had dissolved, the ocean still bound Portugal to a global community of Lusophone nations, sustaining ties of commerce, diplomacy, and culture. New generations, growing up in a democratic and European Portugal, learned to see This legacy not as imperial nostalgia but as a testament to the power of curiosity, resilience and cultural exchange. Thus, as the last remnants of empire faded into history, Portugal entered the modern era as a small yet confident nation. It no longer commanded colonies or ruled distant peoples, but it carried forward a language spoken by hundreds of millions, a culinary and artistic heritage that spanned continents, and a deep tradition of maritime exploration that continued to inspire. The age of empire had ended, but the sea and the connections it fostered endured, linking Portugal's past to its present and carrying echoes of its voyages into the future.